Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true Pacific Northwest mysterious forest horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in the ancient wilderness of Oregon and Washington. These are not fictional tales, but documented encounters shared by people who ventured into the mist-shrouded forests, where something inexplicable waits in the shadows. Each story has been compiled from official reports, witness statements, and investigative records that paint a picture too disturbing to dismiss. The Pacific Northwest holds secrets that defy rational explanation. And tonight, you will hear accounts that have left investigators baffled and witnesses forever changed. If you enjoy authentic horror content that is grounded in reality and will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters with the unexplained. Now, settle in as we explore the darkness that dwells in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Jack had been a park ranger in Oregon's Cascade Range for nearly 8 years. And in that time, he had learned to read the forest like most people read a newspaper. Every broken branch, every displaced rock, every unusual pattern in the undergrowth told him something about what had happened in his territory. On the morning of October 3rd, those signs were telling him something was very wrong. The autumn air was crisp and sharp with the scent of pine as he began his routine patrol along the southeastern quadrant of his jurisdiction. An area that encompassed over 40 square miles of dense forest, rocky terrain, and isolated mountain trails that saw fewer than a dozen hikers per week during the off-season. This was the kind of wilderness where people came to disappear from the world for a while, to find peace and solitude, and where most visitors left nothing behind but footprints and took nothing but photographs. But as Jack rounded a bend in the trail near Clearwater Creek, he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. An abandoned campsite sat in a small clearing about 30 yards from the main trail, and everything about it was wrong. The tent was still standing, fully erected and properly staked, with the rain fly secured against the morning dew. A portable camping stove sat on a flat rock with a pot of what looked like oatmeal still sitting on the burner. And when Jack approached cautiously and touched the side of the pot, he found it was barely warm, suggesting it had been cooked within the past hour or two. 2 camping chairs were arranged around a circle of stones that contained the remains of a campfire, and a pair of expensive hiking boots sat neatly outside the tent entrance. Jack called out, his voice echoing through the trees, but received no response except the distant cry of a hawk and the rustling of wind through the evergreens. He checked the tent interior and found 2 sleeping bags, personal belongings carefully organized in backpacks, wallets containing identification and cash, and cell phones sitting on top of folded clothes. Everything valuable was still there, which immediately ruled out theft as a motive for whatever had happened. The identification cards told him the camp belonged to Madison Morgan and Luke Bell, both from Seattle, both in their mid-20s, both reported as experienced hikers according to the permits they had filed with the ranger station 3 days earlier. Jack pulled out his radio and reported the abandoned camp to headquarters, then began a careful examination of the surrounding area. That was when he found the first sign of real trouble. About 15 feet from the camp, heading deeper into the forest and away from any established trail, he discovered a scattered trail of personal items. A fleece jacket lay crumpled against a fallen log. 50 feet beyond that, he found a baseball cap tangled in low brush. Then a water bottle dropped and left where it fell. The cap still on, water still inside. These were not items someone had accidentally lost while hiking. They were items someone had dropped while running or while being dragged. Jack's pulse quickened as he followed the trail of belongings deeper into the woods, moving away from the established paths and into territory that few people ever explored. The forest here was older, darker, with trees so densely packed that the morning sun barely penetrated the canopy above. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and devil's club, and Jack had to push through vegetation that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Then he saw the blood. It was not much at first, just a smear on the bark of a Douglas fir, about shoulder height on an average person. But as he moved forward, he found more. Droplets on leaves, a larger stain on a moss-covered rock. And then, most disturbing of all, drag marks in the soft earth near a small ravine. Two parallel lines that suggested something heavy had been pulled across the ground. Jack's hands shook slightly as he reached for his radio again. But when he pressed the transmit button, all he got was static. He checked the device and found it was working properly. But somehow, in this particular section of forest, he was getting no signal at all. This was unusual because the ranger radios were specifically designed to work in remote areas, using repeater towers positioned throughout the mountain range. He tried his cell phone with the same result. No signal, no connection, nothing. The silence of the forest suddenly seemed oppressive, and Jack became acutely aware that he was alone, miles from the nearest road, following what appeared to be evidence of a violent crime into increasingly isolated terrain. He made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of continuing forward, he would mark his location using GPS coordinates from his handheld device, then return to the campsite and hike back to an area where his radio worked so he could call for backup. But as he turned to retrace his steps, he heard something that froze him in place. A voice, weak and terrified, calling out from somewhere ahead. It was a female voice, and she was saying one word over and over again. Help. Jack abandoned his plan to retreat and pushed forward through the undergrowth, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow, following the sound of that desperate voice. He found her about 200 yards from where he had last seen blood, hidden inside a large hollow log that had fallen years ago and was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Madison was curled into a ball, her clothes torn and muddy, her face streaked with tears and scratches from running through brush. Her eyes were wild with fear, and when she first saw Jack, she screamed and tried to push herself further back into the log until he identified himself as a park ranger and showed her his badge and uniform. Getting her out of the log and calmed down enough to speak coherently took nearly 15 minutes, and what she told him turned his blood cold. She and Luke had been sleeping in their tent when something woke them just before dawn. At first, they thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear investigating their camp. So Luke had unzipped the tent to look outside. Madison said she heard him say something. She could not remember what. And then there was a sound, like someone hitting something solid, a dull thud, and Luke made a choking noise. She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and looked outside to see a figure dragging Luke away from the tent by his feet, pulling him into the forest. The figure was human. She was certain of that. But in the dim pre-dawn light, she could not make out any details except that it was large, probably male, and wearing dark clothing. Madison had grabbed her jacket and started to follow, screaming at the person to stop. And that was when the figure had dropped Luke's legs and started running toward her instead. She had run. She did not remember dropping her jacket or her hat or anything else. She just remembered crashing through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at her skin and clothes, her lungs burning, and behind her, the sound of someone giving chase. She had run until her legs gave out, and then she had found the hollow log and crawled inside, pulling dead leaves and forest debris in behind her to hide. She had been there for hours, listening to footsteps moving through the area around her, stopping occasionally as if the person was searching, then moving on. She had stayed silent even when she heard Jack calling out earlier because she was too terrified to determine if the voice was friendly or a trick. Jack asked her if she had any idea where Luke might be now, and Madison shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. She said she thought he was dead because the sound he had made when he was hit was awful, and she had seen blood on his head when the figure was dragging him. Jack knew he had to get Madison to safety and bring in law enforcement immediately. But he also knew that if Luke was injured somewhere in this forest, every minute counted. He made the difficult decision to get Madison moving toward an area where his radio would work. And as they walked, he kept his eyes scanning the forest around them, looking for any sign of movement, any indication they were being watched. The walk back to the abandoned campsite took 45 minutes because Madison was exhausted and injured, her ankles swollen from twisting it during her panicked flight through the forest. When they finally reached the camp, Jack tried his radio again and found it was working. He immediately called for emergency backup, requesting both law enforcement and search and rescue teams. And he reported a possible homicide in progress. The response was swift. Within an hour, the forest was swarming with sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and additional park rangers with tracking dogs. Jack led a team of 3 deputies back to the area where he had found Madison. And from there, they followed the drag marks he had discovered earlier. The trail led to a steep ravine where a small creek ran through moss-covered rocks. And there, partially concealed beneath a pile of dead branches and forest debris, they found Luke. He was dead. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head. And based on the condition of the body and the surrounding evidence, he had been killed quickly and then hidden. But what made the discovery even more disturbing was what the deputies found approximately 50 yards downstream. Another pile of branches, deliberately arranged to conceal something, and beneath it, another body. This one was older, probably dead for several weeks, based on the state of decomposition. And it was identified through personal effects as belonging to a hiker who had been reported missing 6 weeks earlier. His name was Anthony Bailey, and he had been hiking alone when he disappeared without a trace. The investigation expanded rapidly. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and over the next 3 days, they made discoveries that turned the case into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Oregon's history. In total, they found 14 bodies buried or concealed in various locations within a 3-mile radius of where Luke had been killed. Some were recent, some were years old, representing missing persons cases that had gone cold long ago. Forensic evidence suggested all the victims had died from blunt force trauma or strangulation, and several showed signs of having been bound with rope before death. The killer had been using this section of forest as a dumping ground for what investigators estimated was at least a decade, possibly longer. What made the case even more chilling was the realization that the killer had a pattern. Almost all the victims had been camping alone or in pairs in remote areas of the forest, far from established campgrounds, in locations where they could be attacked without anyone hearing their screams. For Jack, the days following the discovery were a blur of interviews with detectives, crime scene processing, and the grim task of helping search teams navigate the increasingly cordoned-off sections of his forest. He learned details he wished he did not know about how the killer had operated, the careful way evidence had been concealed, the planning that went into selecting victims who would not be immediately missed. Madison was placed in protective custody for several days because there was genuine concern that the killer might try to eliminate the only witness who had seen him. Even if she could not provide a detailed description, a massive manhunt was launched, with dozens of law enforcement officers combing through the forest, setting up trail cameras, and interviewing anyone who had been in the area during the time frame when the murders had occurred. But despite the extensive investigation, despite the forensic evidence and the witness testimony and the physical evidence left at the scenes, the killer was never identified. Weeks turned into months, and the case remained open, but with no viable suspects. The forest where Jack had worked for 8 years, a place he had loved and felt at home in, had been transformed in his mind into something sinister. He requested a transfer to a different ranger district, unable to continue working in an area where he knew 14 people had been murdered, and where the person responsible was still out there somewhere. Madison, he learned through follow-up reports, had left Washington entirely, moving across the country to live with family in North Carolina, unable to cope with the trauma of what she had experienced and witnessed. She would spend years in therapy, dealing with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, haunted by the memory of watching Luke being dragged into the darkness, and by the knowledge that she had been unable to save him. The case file remained open, marked as an active investigation. But as years passed with no new leads, it gradually moved to the cold case division. Jack heard updates occasionally through law enforcement contacts he had maintained. But there was never anything substantial. No arrests, no credible suspects, no closure for the families of the 14 victims whose bodies had been found, or for the families of others who were still missing and might never be found. Jack transferred to a ranger station in a different state, tried to rebuild his career and his peace of mind. But he never quite succeeded in leaving that October morning behind. He still had nightmares sometimes about walking through that dark section of forest, about finding the drag marks and the blood, about the sound of Madison's terrified voice calling for help from inside that hollow log. And he thought often about the killer, still out there somewhere, potentially still active, still hunting in forests where rangers like him worked alone and hikers ventured into the wilderness believing they were safe. The Pacific Northwest is vast, with millions of acres of forest where a person could disappear and never be found. And somewhere in that wilderness, a killer had learned how to exploit that isolation to deadly effect, leaving behind a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Layla had been working as a wildlife biologist for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife for just over 3 years when she was assigned to a nocturnal animal study in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The project was straightforward in concept, but challenging in execution. She needed to set up audio recording equipment in multiple locations throughout a designated research area to track owl populations, monitor their hunting patterns, and document their territorial calls throughout the breeding season. The work required her to spend extended periods alone in the forest, often camping for 5 to 7 days at a stretch in remote areas, far from established trails or campgrounds. Layla had always been comfortable in wilderness settings. She had grown up camping with her family in various national forests across the Pacific Northwest, and her graduate studies had taken her into some of the most isolated terrain in North America. The solitude did not bother her, and she had developed the kind of practical wilderness skills that made solo fieldwork manageable rather than dangerous. Her assigned research area was located in the southern section of Gifford Pinchot, a region known for its old-growth forest, steep ravines, and limited human access. During her initial site survey and equipment setup, she had spoken briefly with a ranger who mentioned, almost casually, that the local indigenous tribes considered certain sections of this forest to be spiritually significant and traditionally avoided specific areas entirely. The ranger had laughed a bit awkwardly when sharing this information, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to mention such things in a professional context. And Layla had filed the information away as interesting cultural background, but nothing that directly affected her research protocols. She should have paid more attention. On her third night in the field, working from a base camp she had established near a small creek, Layla reviewed the audio recordings her equipment had captured over the previous 48 hours. She sat in her tent with her laptop, headphones on, listening to hours of forest sounds compressed into manageable segments by software that identified and flagged potential owl vocalizations. Most of what she heard was exactly what she expected. The rustle of wind through evergreen branches, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant sound of water moving over rocks, the calls of various owl species, each distinct and identifiable. But approximately 3 hours into her review, she heard something that made her stop the playback and rewind to listen again. It was a voice. Not an animal sound that might be interpreted as voice-like, but an actual human voice, faint and distant, seeming to call out a single word. She increased the volume and isolated the audio segment, listening to it repeatedly. The voice was calling a name, and the name it was calling was hers. Layla. The sound was stretched and distorted, as if the recording equipment had somehow captured it at the wrong speed. But it was unmistakably her name, pronounced with 2 syllables. Layla, in a tone that seemed almost questioning, as if someone was searching for her in the darkness. Layla checked the timestamp on the recording. The audio had been captured at 2:47 in the morning, during a period when she had been asleep in her tent, miles away from the nearest established trail, in an area where no other researchers or hikers were scheduled to be working. She examined the equipment specifications and settings, wondering if there was some technical explanation for what she was hearing. Perhaps radio interference from a distant source, or some kind of audio artifact created by the recording process itself. But the equipment was designed specifically for field research, with filters to eliminate electronic interference, and the voice did not sound like radio transmission. It sounded like someone standing in the forest, calling out into the night. She told herself it was probably nothing. Sound traveled in strange ways through dense forest, especially at night, when temperature inversions and humidity could carry noises for miles. Maybe there had been another camper or hiker in the area, farther away than she realized, and they had been calling to someone else who just happened to share her name. The next night, she checked her recordings again, and once more, she heard her name. This time, there were multiple instances, captured at different times throughout the night by different recording devices positioned at various locations around her research area. Each voice sounded slightly different, as if multiple people were calling to her from different directions. But all of them were saying her name in that same stretched, distorted way that made her skin crawl. She began to feel genuinely uneasy. There was no reasonable explanation for multiple voices, recorded by separate devices, all calling the same uncommon name in the middle of a forest, where she was supposedly alone. Layla was a scientist by training and temperament, someone who looked for logical explanations and evidence-based conclusions. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize when something felt wrong. This felt wrong. On the fourth night of her field session, the situation escalated from unsettling to frightening. Layla was conducting a routine check of her equipment, replacing batteries in one of the recording units positioned about half a mile from her camp, when she heard the voice calling her name without any electronic device to mediate the sound. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the reach of her flashlight beam, a voice that seemed to echo between the trees, calling Layla with that same distorted, questioning intonation she had heard on the recordings. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, every sense suddenly hyper-alert. She called out, asking if anyone was there, identifying herself as a researcher working in the area. The only response was silence. And then, after perhaps 30 seconds, the voice called again, this time from a different direction. Layla made a decision that probably saved her life, or at least her sanity. She abandoned the equipment she had been servicing and walked quickly back toward her camp. Not quite running, but moving fast, her flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her on the narrow trail. Behind her, she heard the voice calling again, and then again, always from a slightly different location, as if whatever was producing the sound was moving through the forest parallel to her path. When she reached her camp, she climbed into her tent and sealed the entrance, suddenly feeling very vulnerable and very alone. She tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe someone was playing a prank on her, though that seemed absurdly elaborate for a joke. Maybe she was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by stress or isolation, though she had never had any mental health issues and had spent plenty of time alone in wilderness settings without incident. Maybe there was an animal in the area that could mimic human speech, though no species native to the Pacific Northwest had that capability. None of her explanations felt adequate, and as she lay in her sleeping bag, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she realized she could still hear the voice, faintly, calling her name from somewhere outside the tent. Then her equipment started malfunctioning. The batteries in her flashlight died, even though she had replaced them that morning with fresh ones from a sealed package. Her GPS unit powered off and would not restart. Her satellite phone showed a full battery but could not establish a connection when she tried to call her supervisor. Even her watch, a simple digital device, began displaying random numbers instead of the correct time. Layla had brought backup batteries for everything, standard protocol for extended field work, and she systematically replaced every battery in every device she had. Some of the devices powered back on, but within minutes they would shut off again, as if something was draining the power impossibly fast. She sat in the darkness of her tent, too frightened to sleep, listening to her name being called over and over from various points around her campsite. At some point during that endless night, she must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion because she woke to find it was dawn. The forest was silent. The oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. Her equipment was functioning normally again. She checked the recordings from the night before and found that every single device had captured the same thing. Hours of her name being called, in multiple voices, from impossible directions, with no other sounds to provide context or explanation. She also discovered something that made her blood run cold. According to the GPS, timestamps on her various devices, she had lost approximately 2 hours. Her memory of the night was continuous, with no gaps. But the timeline showed a period from just after midnight until nearly 2:30 in the morning where no recordings existed and no device logs showed any activity, as if she and all her equipment had simply ceased to exist for that period of time. Worse than the lost time was what happened next. When she went to check on the recording device she had been servicing when she first heard the voices, the device she had abandoned in her panic to return to camp, she found that it was not where she had left it. She remembered the exact location, a distinctive spot where a fallen log created a natural acoustic chamber that would enhance owl calls from the surrounding area. She returned to that location and found nothing. The device was gone, along with its mounting hardware, the camouflage netting she had used to conceal it, and the bright yellow marker tape she had tied to a nearby branch to help her locate the spot. She expanded her search, thinking perhaps she had confused the location in her frightened state the night before, but found no trace of the equipment anywhere within a reasonable radius. It was as if someone or something had deliberately removed every trace that she had ever been there. Even more disturbing, when she looked for her own footprints from the night before, the trail she had followed in her rush back to camp, she found something that should not have been possible. Her footprints were there, clearly visible in the soft earth and scattered pine needles, but alongside them was another set of prints. They were not animal tracks, and they were not human boot prints. They were human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too long and too narrow, with marks that suggested bare feet rather than shoes, and they paralleled her trail for several hundred yards before vanishing completely near a rocky outcropping. That was when Layla decided to end her field session immediately, days ahead of schedule. She packed her essential equipment as quickly as possible, abandoning some of the heavier items and making multiple trips to her vehicle, which was parked at a Forest Service access point approximately 3 miles from her camp. With each trip, she felt an overwhelming urge to keep looking over her shoulder, and several times she could have sworn she saw movement in her peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to vanish when she turned to look directly at them. The hike out was the longest 3 miles of her life. When she finally reached her truck and locked herself inside, she sat there for several minutes just breathing, overwhelmed with relief at being enclosed in metal and glass, separated from the forest by something solid and familiar. She drove directly to the ranger station and filed a report about her missing equipment, though she did not mention the voices or the strange footprints or the feeling of being watched. She did not think anyone would believe her, and she was not entirely sure she believed herself. The research project was quietly suspended, pending an investigation into the missing equipment. Layla submitted what recordings she had managed to collect, and they were turned over to the project supervisors for analysis. She heard later, through unofficial channels, that the audio files had been reviewed by several specialists who could not provide any satisfactory explanation for the voices. Some suggested electronic interference, despite the equipment's filtering capabilities. Others proposed that Layla had experienced a psychological episode and somehow created the recordings herself, perhaps through sleepwalking or dissociative behavior. Though this explanation failed to account for the multiple simultaneous recordings from devices positioned far apart. One analyst who examined the audio files noted that the voices, when filtered and analyzed for phonetic structure, appeared to be speaking in a language or dialect that did not match any currently known indigenous language from the Pacific Northwest region, but showed structural similarities to several extinct languages documented by anthropologists in the early 20th century. The ranger who had originally mentioned the local tribal warnings about certain areas contacted Layla privately and arranged a meeting with an elder from the Cowlitz tribe. The elder listened to a brief description of what Layla had experienced and nodded slowly, as if none of it surprised him. He explained that the area where she had been working was known traditionally as a burial ground, a place where the dead had been laid to rest, according to practices that predated European contact by hundreds or possibly thousands of years. The land was considered sacred and forbidden, not because it was evil, but because the spirits there were active and did not welcome intrusion from the living. He said that the voices she heard were likely ancestors trying to drive her away, not to harm her, but to protect the sanctity of their resting place. When Layla asked why the voices had been calling her name, the elder explained that speaking someone's name creates a connection, a spiritual link, and that by calling to her, the spirits were marking her, making sure she would never forget what she had experienced and would never return. Layla never went back to that section of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. She requested reassignment to a different research project in a different location, and her supervisors agreed without requiring detailed explanations. But the experience did not end when she left the forest. For months afterward, she would occasionally hear her name being called in that same distorted voice, usually at night when she was on the edge of sleep, or sometimes during the day in moments of quiet. The phenomenon gradually faded over time, but never disappeared entirely. Years later, Layla still experiences occasional episodes, brief moments where she hears her name called from no identifiable source, a reminder that something in that forest had reached out to her and left a mark that would last the rest of her life. She left wildlife biology entirely, transitioning into laboratory research, where she would never again have to spend nights alone in isolated wilderness areas. And she has never publicly discussed the details of what happened during those 4 days in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, knowing that some experiences cannot be adequately explained or understood through the framework of empirical science. Isaac and Nora had been hiking together for over 5 years, exploring trails throughout Washington and Oregon, with the methodical precision of experienced backcountry enthusiasts who understood that preparation and awareness were the difference between adventure and disaster. They were not casual weekend hikers who stuck to popular trails near parking areas. They sought out challenging terrain, multi-day trips into remote wilderness, and routes that required navigation skills beyond following wooden trail markers. Both wore GPS watches that tracked their elevation, heart rate, distance traveled, and exact coordinates at any given moment. Both carried paper maps and compasses as backup. Both had completed wilderness first aid training and carried emergency supplies that could sustain them for several days if something went wrong. On September 15th, they planned what should have been a straightforward day hike in the North Cascades, a trail they had completed successfully 3 times before over the past 2 years. The hike was approximately 11 miles round trip, with an elevation gain of 2,800 feet, leading to an alpine lake surrounded by peaks that offered spectacular views on clear days. They started at 7:30 in the morning, signed in at the trailhead register, and began the familiar ascent through dense forest that would eventually give way to subalpine meadows and rocky terrain near the lake. The first 2 hours of the hike were exactly as they remembered from previous trips. They passed landmarks they recognized: the massive cedar tree split by lightning, the creek crossing where they always stopped to filter water, the rocky outcropping where they had once seen a black bear foraging for berries. Everything was normal and familiar until approximately mile marker 4, where the forest suddenly changed in a way that made no sense given the terrain and elevation. The trees became noticeably quieter. That was the first thing Nora mentioned to Isaac, the absence of sound. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through branches. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to absorb their footsteps and voices. Isaac checked his GPS watch and frowned. According to the device, they were no longer on the trail they had been following. The coordinates showed them as being nearly 3 miles west of where they should have been, in an area that their map indicated was dense, unmarked forest with no established trails. But they were still standing on a clear trail, following markers that looked identical to the ones they had been seeing all morning. They stopped and compared their watches. Both devices showed the same impossible location. Both showed the correct date, but displayed a time that was wrong. According to their watches, it was now 11:45 in the morning. But that could not be correct, because they had checked the time less than 20 minutes earlier at the creek crossing, and it had been 9:30. Even accounting for the difficulty of the terrain, there was no way they had hiked for over 2 hours in what felt like 20 minutes. Isaac suggested that perhaps their watches had malfunctioned simultaneously, some kind of software glitch or magnetic interference from the geology of the area. They tried to rationalize the situation, but both of them felt an increasing sense of unease that went beyond mere confusion about their location. They decided to turn back, to retrace their steps to the last point where they knew their location had been accurate. But when they turned around, the trail behind them looked different. The landmarks they had passed were gone. The split cedar tree was nowhere in sight. The creek where they had filtered water was not where it should have been. The trail itself seemed to wind through terrain they did not recognize, even though they had been walking through this exact area moments before. Nora pulled out the paper map and compass, attempting to orient themselves without relying on the GPS devices that were clearly providing inaccurate information. But the compass behaved strangely, the needle spinning slowly without settling on a consistent direction, as if magnetic north had become unstable or irrelevant. They started walking in what they believed was the direction back to the trailhead, using the angle of the sun and their general sense of the terrain to guide them. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge how frightened they were becoming. They were experienced hikers who had dealt with getting temporarily lost before, who had navigated in poor visibility and challenging conditions. But this was different. This felt fundamentally wrong in a way that neither could fully articulate. After what felt like an hour of walking, though their watches now showed only 15 minutes had passed, they emerged from the forest into an area they did not recognize at all. They were standing at the edge of a large clearing that should not have existed anywhere near their planned route. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, and the ground was bare earth with no vegetation except for strange patterns of dead grass that formed lines and shapes that looked almost deliberate. In the center of the clearing was a cluster of rocks arranged in a way that seemed too geometric to be natural. Isaac and Nora stood at the tree line, both of them instinctively reluctant to enter the clearing. And that was when they noticed their skin. On their exposed arms and the backs of their hands were marks they had not had before. Small, circular burns, each about the size of a quarter, raised and red as if they had been touched by something very hot. The marks were not painful, but they were definitely new, and neither Isaac nor Nora had any memory of how they had gotten them. Isaac looked at his watch again and saw something that made his stomach drop. The time display now showed 2:15 in the afternoon. Hours had passed. but he had no memory of those hours. The last clear moment he could recall with certainty was emerging from the forest into the clearing, which, according to his subjective experience, had happened only minutes ago. He asked Nora what time she thought it was, without telling her what his watch said. And she replied that it should be around noon, maybe 12:30 at the latest. When she looked at her own watch and saw the time, her face went pale. They both stood there, trying to understand what was happening, trying to access memories that should have existed, but did not. There were no gaps in their awareness, no sensation of time passing, just a sudden discontinuity between what they experienced and what their devices were recording. They were still standing at the edge of the clearing, but now the sun was in a different position in the sky, confirming that hours had indeed passed. Their clothing was torn in places neither could explain. Their boots were covered in mud that was not consistent with the dry trail they had been hiking. Nora noticed blood on Isaac's shirt, a small stain near his collar, and when she pointed it out, he touched his neck and found a scratch he had not felt until that moment. Nora had similar scratches on her arms, hidden beneath the sleeves of her jacket, until she pushed them up to examine her skin more closely. They made a decision to start moving again, to try to find any landmark or trail marker that would help them determine where they actually were and how to get back to their vehicle. They avoided entering the clearing, instead circling around its perimeter, staying within the tree line. As they moved, Isaac's GPS watch suddenly began working normally again. The coordinates it displayed now made sense, showing them as being approximately 15 miles from the trailhead, far beyond the endpoint of their planned hike, in an area that should have taken them all day to reach at a normal hiking pace. The trail they found led them downhill, and eventually they intersected with a Forest Service road where they encountered two hikers who stared at them with concern and asked if they needed help. Isaac and Nora must have looked terrible, muddy and scratched and disoriented, because the hikers immediately offered water and asked if they were injured. They learned from these hikers that they were on the opposite side of the mountain range from where they had started, having somehow traveled in a direction perpendicular to their intended route. The hikers drove them back to the ranger station, where their vehicle was parked, a journey that took over an hour by truck on Forest Service roads. At the ranger station, they filed a report about getting lost, though they did not mention the missing hours or the strange clearing or the burns on their skin. They told the rangers they had become disoriented and must have taken a wrong turn, a plausible explanation that was accepted without question. But privately, both Isaac and Nora knew that what had happened to them could not be explained by simple navigational error. They were examined at a hospital the following day at Nora's insistence, and the doctor who looked at the circular burns on their skin ordered additional tests, including a scan to check for radiation exposure. The results showed elevated levels of radiation, not enough to cause immediate health concerns, but definitely abnormal and inconsistent with natural environmental exposure. The case was noted in their medical records, and somehow the information reached researchers who had been documenting unusual incidents in the North Cascades region. Isaac and Nora learned that they were not the first hikers to report missing time, unexplained injuries, and memory gaps in that particular area. Over the past 30 years, at least a dozen similar cases had been documented, all sharing common elements: experienced hikers on familiar trails, sudden disorientation, GPS and compass malfunctions, hours of missing time with no conscious memory, unexplained physical marks on the body. The Forest Service had no official explanation for these incidents, but the area remained open to public access with standard warnings about wilderness hazards. Isaac and Nora never hiked in the North Cascades again. both of them profoundly disturbed by the experience and by the knowledge that something had happened to them that they could not remember or understand. The burns on their skin faded slowly over several months, leaving faint scars that they carry to this day, permanent reminders of the hours that vanished and the questions that will never be answered. Dylan had taken the fire lookout position for practical reasons rather than romantic ones. The job paid reasonably well for 6 weeks of work, provided free housing in the form of a small cabin mounted on a tower platform, and required minimal qualifications beyond the ability to tolerate extended solitude and maintain vigilance for signs of wildfire. He was 24 years old, recently graduated with a degree in environmental science, and struggling to find permanent employment in his field. The lookout position in Washington's Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest seemed like an ideal way to earn money, while gaining experience in wilderness management and building his resume with tangible forestry work. The training had been straightforward. He learned to use the Firefinder, a circular map with crosshairs that allowed him to pinpoint the exact location of smoke sightings. He learned the radio protocols for reporting potential fires to the district office. He learned basic weather observation and how to maintain the solar panels and batteries that powered his communications equipment, and the small refrigerator that kept his food from spoiling. The ranger who conducted his training had been matter-of-fact about the challenges of the position. The isolation could be psychologically difficult for some people. The weather could turn hostile with little warning, bringing storms that would rock the entire tower structure and test his nerve. The days could be monotonously identical, with nothing happening for weeks at a time, which created its own kind of mental strain. But the ranger had not mentioned anything unusual about this particular tower, and Dylan had no reason to expect anything beyond the normal challenges of lookout work. His first week passed exactly as expected. He established a routine that broke up the long days into manageable segments. Morning weather observation and radio check-in at 6. Breakfast and equipment maintenance until 8. First scan of the forest with binoculars, reading or writing in his journal until the next scheduled scan. Lunch at noon. Afternoon scans every 2 hours. Dinner at 6. Evening scan at sunset. Then the long night hours with nothing to do except read by lantern light or listen to downloaded podcasts until sleep became possible. The tower stood in a clearing that had been deliberately maintained to prevent trees from obstructing the 360-degree view necessary for fire detection. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 100 yards in diameter, surrounded by dense forest that pressed close on all sides. During the day, Dylan found the isolation peaceful rather than oppressive. He could see for miles in every direction when weather permitted, watching the play of light and shadow across distant ridges, tracking weather systems as they moved through the valleys, observing wildlife that occasionally ventured into the clearing. But at night, the clearing became something different. The darkness beyond the reach of his tower lights was absolute, and the forest sounds that had seemed pleasant during daylight hours took on an edge that made him uneasy in ways he could not fully justify. It was on the 8th night of his rotation that he first noticed the figure. He had finished his sunset scan and was preparing for bed when he happened to glance out the north-facing window. Standing at the very edge of the clearing, precisely where the maintained grass met the tree line, was a human shape. The figure was too far away and the light too dim to make out any details. But it was definitely person-shaped, standing completely motionless, apparently looking directly at the tower. Dylan felt a jolt of surprise, followed by curiosity. It was unusual, but not impossible for a hiker to be in this area. The tower was accessible by a trail that connected to the broader trail system, though most hikers avoided the steep climb required to reach the lookout unless they specifically wanted to visit the tower itself. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the cabin door, stepping onto the small platform that surrounded the structure. He called out a greeting, his voice carrying across the clearing. There was no response. The figure remained motionless. Dylan aimed his flashlight beam toward the location where he had seen the shape, but the light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness without illuminating anything clearly. He could still see the outline of the figure, but the flashlight beam somehow failed to reveal any additional detail. He called out again, asking if the person needed assistance, wondering if perhaps this was a hiker who had become lost or injured. Still no response. After several minutes of this one-sided interaction, Dylan retreated back into the cabin, feeling unsettled, but not yet frightened. He told himself that the figure was probably just someone who had camped nearby and was out for an evening walk. The lack of response could be explained by distance, or by the person wearing headphones, or simply by someone who preferred not to engage in social interaction. He tried to dismiss the encounter and focus on other things, but he found himself repeatedly returning to the north window to check if the figure was still there. It was. For the next 3 hours, until Dylan finally fell asleep despite his unease, the figure remained in exactly the same position, apparently never moving, never responding to any attempt at communication. When Dylan woke the next morning and immediately checked the window, the figure was gone. The clearing was empty in the early morning light, showing nothing unusual. He considered reporting the incident during his morning radio check-in, but decided against it. What would he report? That someone had been standing at the edge of the clearing, that they had not answered when he called to them. It seemed absurd to make an official report about something so minor. But that night, the figure returned. Same location, same posture, same unnerving stillness. Dylan tried the flashlight again with the same lack of result. He tried taking a photograph with his phone camera, but the image showed only darkness with no visible figure. Even though Dylan could see it clearly with his naked eyes when he looked up from the phone screen. He tried using the tower's binoculars, which should have provided much greater detail at that distance. But when he looked through the lenses, the figures seemed to blur and become indistinct, as if the binoculars were unable to focus properly on that specific location. Night after night, the pattern repeated. The figure would appear shortly after sunset, always in the exact same spot, and would remain there for hours. Dylan began timing these appearances and found they followed a precise schedule, arriving at the clearing edge at 8:47 in the evening and remaining visible until 12:15 in the morning, then vanishing sometime between 12:15 and 12:30 when Dylan's attention was elsewhere. He started documenting the phenomenon in his journal, not because he thought anyone would believe him, but because the act of writing helped him process what he was experiencing. On the 15th night, something changed. The figure was closer. Not dramatically so, but definitely closer than it had been on previous nights. Instead of standing at the tree line, it was now positioned approximately 10 yards into the clearing. Dylan felt his heart rate increase as he realized the figure had moved without him witnessing any movement. It had simply appeared closer, as if it had teleported from one location to another during the moments when he was not looking. The next night, it was closer still, then closer again. By the 20th night, the figure was standing roughly halfway between the tree line and the base of the tower, and Dylan was genuinely frightened. He called the Ranger District office during his morning check-in and tried to explain what was happening, carefully framing it as a possible security concern about someone repeatedly approaching the tower at night. The ranger who took his call was sympathetic, but not particularly alarmed. They suggested it might be an animal that Dylan was misidentifying in poor lighting conditions, or perhaps a standing deadwood snag that looked human-shaped and that he was noticing more because he was focusing on it. Dylan did not argue, but he knew what he was seeing was not an animal or a tree. On the 23rd night, Dylan found footprints. He had descended the tower stairs to check the base of the structure, something he had been avoiding doing after dark. But his need for verification overcame his fear. Using his flashlight, he found clear boot prints in the soft earth around the tower foundation. The prints led from the direction of the tree line directly to the tower, circled the structure twice, then led back toward the Yao forest. But the prints did not reach the tree line. They simply ended in the middle of the clearing, as if the person making them had vanished into thin air or had been picked up and carried away. Dylan climbed back up to the cabin and locked the door, suddenly very aware of how vulnerable he was. The tower was designed to keep him safe from wildlife and weather, not from human intruders. The walls were thin. The door had a basic lock that could be forced easily. The windows did not lock at all, designed to open wide for maximum visibility during fire watch operations. That night, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps on the tower stairs, the metallic clang of boots on steel steps, ascending slowly, one step at a time. Dylan sat frozen in the center of the cabin, his phone in his hand, unable to decide if he should call for help or if that would make whatever was happening worse. The footsteps continued, methodical and unhurried, climbing the 72 steps from the ground to the cabin platform. When they reached the top, they stopped. Dylan waited, every muscle tense, staring at the door. Minutes passed in silence. Then he heard scratching, a slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails or claws being dragged across the wooden door frame. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 5 minutes. Then it stopped. The footsteps began again, this time descending, and eventually faded into silence. Dylan did not sleep that night. When dawn finally came, he immediately radioed the district office and requested emergency extraction, breaking protocol by describing the incident in detail and stating that he would not spend another night in the tower under any circumstances. The ranger who responded to his call seemed concerned, not about the supernatural aspects of Dylan's report, but about Dylan's mental state. They arranged for a replacement lookout to be sent up immediately and told Dylan he could come down as soon as the replacement arrived. While he waited for his relief, Dylan went outside in full daylight to examine the door where he had heard the scratching. The wood showed fresh gouges, deep parallel marks that could not have been caused by any animal native to the area. When the replacement lookout arrived, Dylan provided a brief handover of the equipment and procedures, but did not mention the figure or the footsteps or the scratching sounds. He simply gathered his personal belongings and hiked down the trail as quickly as the terrain allowed, desperate to put distance between himself and that tower. Later, through informal channels, Dylan learned that he was the third lookout in 5 years to request early termination from that specific tower position. The ranger who told him this information did so quietly, almost reluctantly, and mentioned that the tower was now being equipped with remote cameras and sensors so that it could be monitored from the district office without requiring a human occupant. The official explanation for this change was budget efficiency and technological advancement. But Dylan suspected the real reason was that no one wanted to address the fact that something was watching that tower, something that appeared like clockwork and grew closer each night. something that left footprints that ended in empty air and scratched at doors with claws or fingernails that left marks too deep to ignore. Dylan was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress and anxiety disorder following his experience. He underwent several months of therapy and was advised to avoid isolated work environments in the future. He never returned to fire lookout work and eventually left the forestry field entirely, unable to shake the memory of those nights watching the figure approach or the sound of footsteps climbing toward him in the darkness. Camilla had built a modest following for her true crime podcast through meticulous research and a commitment to covering cases that other creators overlooked. She focused primarily on cold cases, unsolved disappearances, and regional mysteries that had faded from public attention despite it never being resolved. Her latest project had drawn her to the Oregon forests south of Portland, where a cluster of disappearances over the past 15 years had formed a pattern that she found deeply troubling. 8 hikers had vanished from a specific area spanning roughly 5 miles of mountainous terrain. All had been hiking alone. All had disappeared during daylight hours. All had been experienced outdoors, people who knew the risks and carried appropriate safety equipment. None of their bodies had ever been found. And in several cases, not even their backpacks or personal effects had been recovered. The local sheriff's department had investigated each case individually, but had never officially connected them as part of a larger pattern. Camilla believed the pattern was impossible to ignore and deserved closer examination. She spent 2 weeks conducting preliminary research, interviewing family members of the missing hikers, reviewing police reports, and studying topographical maps of the area. What emerged was a picture that made her increasingly uneasy. The disappearances occurred in a remarkably consistent time frame, with victims vanishing in September or October of years that followed a 3-year cycle. The last disappearance had been 3 years ago, which meant that according to the pattern, this year marked the next potential incident. Camilla was aware of the risks involved in visiting the location where people had disappeared, but she was also confident in her abilities as a researcher and her understanding of wilderness safety. She planned a careful expedition, filing detailed trip reports with multiple people, bringing satellite communication equipment, and scheduling regular check-ins with her podcast producer. She would spend 2 days hiking through the area, recording audio for her episode, documenting the locations where victims were last seen, and attempting to understand what about this particular section of forest might contribute to the disappearances. The first day of her investigation passed without incident. She hiked established trails, took extensive notes, recorded ambient audio and narration for her podcast, and documented the terrain with photographs and video. The forest was beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive, with massive Douglas firs blocking out much of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight atmosphere even during midday. The undergrowth was dense with ferns and salal, making off-trail travel difficult. She could understand how someone might become disoriented here, but that explanation felt insufficient for explaining 8 disappearances of experienced hikers over 15 years. On her second day, she decided to explore an unmarked trail that one of the family members had mentioned during an interview. According to this family member, their missing relative had been interested in finding an old logging road that supposedly connected to the area. A road that no longer appeared on any official maps, but that locals insisted still existed somewhere in the forest. Camilla found the trail after nearly an hour of searching. It was overgrown and barely visible, marked only by slight indentations in the forest floor and occasional breaks in the undergrowth that suggested a path had once existed here. She followed it for approximately 20 minutes, moving slowly and carefully, her GPS unit tracking her progress and confirming she was still within the general area where disappearances had occurred. The trail led her to a ravine she had not seen marked on any of her maps. A steep-sided depression in the terrain with a small creek running through the bottom. The descent into the ravine was treacherous, requiring her to use trees and exposed roots as handholds. And she made the decision that she would explore the ravine floor for only 30 minutes before returning to safer terrain. What she found at the bottom changed everything. Scattered among the rocks and fallen leaves were personal items. A water bottle with a faded Seattle sports team logo. A hiking boot that looked relatively new despite being partially buried in forest debris. A torn piece of fabric that might have been from a backpack or jacket. Most disturbing was a wallet, water damaged but still containing identification cards and credit cards belonging to one of the missing hikers. Camilla documented everything with photographs, careful not to disturb what was clearly evidence of some kind. She was in the process of marking GPS coordinates when she noticed something else. Structures, if that was the right word, built from forest materials. They were small, perhaps 2 feet tall, made from carefully arranged bones and branches that had been interwoven in patterns that looked deliberate rather than random. She counted 6 of these structures positioned at irregular intervals along the ravine floor. They reminded her of art installations or ritual markers, and they made her profoundly uncomfortable. She was experienced enough with true crime research to know that some serial killers created markers or monuments at dumping sites, ways of claiming territory or commemorating their actions. But these structures had a quality that seemed older, more primitive, as if they had been built according to traditions that predated modern criminal psychology. She was examining the 3rd structure when she heard movement in the forest above her. Not animal movement, which she had become accustomed to during her hiking, but the deliberate sound of a person moving through undergrowth, branches breaking under weight, footsteps that paused and then continued. Camilla called out, identifying herself as a researcher, but received no response. The movement continued, and she realized with growing alarm that whoever was moving through the forest was circling the ravine, changing position, possibly looking down at her from multiple vantage points along the rim. She made a decision to leave immediately. She scrambled back up the steep side of the ravine, her heart pounding, no longer concerned with documenting evidence or following proper research protocols. When she reached the top, she saw a figure perhaps 50 yards away, standing partially concealed behind a large tree. The figure was wearing outdoor clothing similar to her own, dark greens and browns that blended with the forest. But something about their posture and the way they remained partially hidden made Camilla certain this was not a casual encounter with another hiker. She turned and walked quickly back toward the overgrown trail she had followed into this area, fighting the urge to run because she knew running would signal fear and vulnerability. Behind her, she heard the figure following, making no attempt to close the distance, but maintaining a consistent interval of perhaps 40 or 50 yards. Camilla pulled out her satellite communicator and activated the emergency beacon, knowing this would alert authorities to her location and that something was wrong. She continued walking, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. And after approximately 10 minutes, the sounds of pursuit stopped. When she looked back, she saw no one. She continued walking for another hour until she intersected with a more established trail where she encountered a pair of day hikers who confirmed she was heading in the correct direction toward the trailhead parking area. The response to her emergency beacon brought Forest Service rangers and sheriff's deputies to the area within 3 hours. Camilla led them back to the ravine, though it took longer to find than she expected because the landmarks she remembered seemed different in the afternoon light. When they finally located the ravine and descended to its floor, they found nothing. No personal items, no wallet, no structures made from bones and branches. The forest floor looked undisturbed, showing no evidence that anyone had been there recently, including Camilla herself. The deputies were professional, but clearly skeptical. They searched the area thoroughly, finding nothing to corroborate her story. Camilla showed them the photographs on her camera, but when she reviewed the images, she found that most of them had failed to record properly. The photos of the personal items showed only forest floor with no visible objects. The images of the bone structures were completely black, as if taken in darkness, despite the fact that she had recorded them in daylight. Only her GPS coordinates remained, proving she had been in the location she claimed, but providing no evidence of what she said she had found there. One of the deputies mentioned, almost casually, that this was not the first time someone had reported finding evidence in this area that subsequently vanished. He did not elaborate, but Camilla understood the implication. She asked about the person she had seen following her, and the deputies confirmed they had found tracks belonging to two different people, Camilla's and someone else's. But the other tracks ended abruptly in the middle of the forest, with no explanation for how the person making them had departed. The investigation was documented, but produced no actionable leads. The wallet Camilla had photographed, which would have been critical evidence in a missing person case, was never recovered. The structures she had documented remained unexplained, with no physical evidence to prove they had existed. Camilla returned to her home state shaken and confused, uncertain about what she had experienced or what it meant. She never released the podcast episode she had been preparing, unable to reconcile her documented research with the impossibility of what had happened in that ravine. In the year following her experience, another hiker disappeared from the same general area. A man in his 30s, hiking alone, last seen on a trail within 2 miles of the ravine Camilla had explored. His disappearance matched the 3-year pattern perfectly, occurring in October, exactly on schedule. The case remains unsolved. Camilla has not returned to Oregon and has shifted her podcast focus entirely away from disappearance cases, concentrating instead on solved crimes with clear documentation and verification. She occasionally receives messages from people who have read about the Oregon disappearances, asking if she plans to continue her investigation, but she always declines. She knows what she found in that ravine, knows that someone or something had been watching her, knows that evidence she documented vanished without explanation. Some stories, she has concluded, are not meant to be told because the telling itself might draw unwanted attention, or because the truth is something that cannot be captured by recording equipment or verified by physical evidence. The forest south of Portland continues to draw hikers who are unaware of the pattern of disappearances, and the area remains officially open despite the unresolved cases. And somewhere in that vast expanse of trees and ravines, questions remain unanswered about what happens to people who venture too deep into places where the boundaries between explanation and mystery become impossible to distinguish. Anthony had worked in the logging industry for 12 years, progressing from equipment operator to crew supervisor through a combination of hard work, practical knowledge, and the kind of steady reliability that employers valued in an industry where safety and efficiency were paramount concerns. His current position with a medium-sized timber company operating in the Oregon Coast Range involved coordinating harvest operations, managing a crew of 15 workers, and ensuring that environmental regulations were followed while still meeting production quotas that determined whether the operation remained profitable. It was demanding work that required balancing competing interests, navigating complex regulations, and making decisions that affected both the company's bottom line and the livelihoods of his crew members. In early November, his team was working a section of forest that had been designated for selective harvest, an area where certain trees could be removed while others were preserved to maintain forest health and comply with sustainability requirements. The marking crew had identified trees approved for cutting, painting bright orange bands around trunks to indicate which specimens could be harvested. Anthony's job was to verify these markings, plan the most efficient sequence for felling and removal, and coordinate the various pieces of heavy equipment that would be necessary to process and transport the timber. On the third day of work in this new section, one of his crew members called him over to examine a massive, old-growth Douglas fir that had been marked for removal. The tree was extraordinary, easily 8 feet in diameter at the base and rising over 200 feet. A specimen that would yield premium lumber and represented significant value. But the crew member was pointing to something else. Carved into the bark, approximately 6 feet up from the ground, were symbols. Not the casual vandalism of initials or graffiti, but deliberate markings that appeared old, weathered by years of exposure. The symbols were geometric patterns that looked vaguely like letters or pictograms, but did not match any alphabet Anthony recognized. The crew member, whose grandfather had worked these same forests decades earlier, explained that local tradition held that trees marked with certain symbols were not to be cut. The exact origins of this tradition were unclear, varying depending on who you asked. But the general consensus was that the marks indicated trees that had spiritual or cultural significance to indigenous groups who had inhabited this region long before European settlement. Anthony had heard similar stories before. Logging in the Pacific Northwest frequently intersected with indigenous cultural sites and traditions, and reputable companies made efforts to identify and avoid such areas. However, these particular marks had not been flagged by the cultural resource surveys conducted before harvest operations began, and the tree itself was on private timber company land, not tribal territory or protected public forest. Anthony documented the symbols with photographs and called his district manager to report the situation. The response he received was not what he expected. The district manager was sympathetic, but made it clear that the company had already invested significant resources in surveying and planning this harvest operation, had obtained all necessary permits, and was under pressure from ownership to meet production targets for the quarter. The tree in question represented nearly $10,000 in immediate value and had been properly marked for harvest according to all legal requirements. If Anthony could find specific legal or regulatory reasons why the tree could not be cut, that would be different. But vague references to local folklore and tradition were not sufficient grounds to leave valuable timber standing. The district manager suggested that Anthony could reach out to local tribal offices if he wanted to pursue the matter further. But he made it clear that any delays in the harvest schedule would need to be justified with concrete evidence of legal violations or cultural resource concerns that had not been addressed in the initial permitting process. Anthony found himself in an uncomfortable position. He personally felt that the marked tree should not be cut, at least not until someone with expertise in indigenous cultural matters could examine the symbols and provide an informed opinion about their significance. But he also understood the economic realities of the industry and the pressure his crew was under to maintain employment in an increasingly uncertain market. He reached out to 2 local tribal offices, leaving detailed messages describing the symbols and providing photograph attachments, but received no immediate responses. After 3 days of waiting, during which his crew continued working on other trees in the area while the marked old growth remained standing, he received instructions from company leadership to proceed with the harvest. The decision had been made at a level above his authority, and his job was to implement it safely and efficiently. The night before the marked tree was scheduled to be felled, every member of Anthony's crew experienced nightmares. This fact only emerged later, when they compared notes, but the consistency of their experiences was remarkable. Different people reported different specific details, but the common themes were suffocating darkness, being lost in endless forest, and a presence watching them with hostile intent. 3 crew members called in sick the following morning, citing various ailments, and 2 others simply did not show up without calling. Anthony himself had barely slept, troubled by dreams he could not quite remember, but that left him with a persistent sense of dread. The remaining crew members were nervous and distracted, and Anthony had to deliver what amounted to a motivational speech about professional responsibility and the importance of following established safety protocols, regardless of personal feelings or superstitions. The felling operation itself was plagued with problems from the beginning. The chainsaw operator reported that his equipment kept stalling, despite having been serviced and maintained according to standard procedures just days earlier. When a backup saw was brought in, it experienced the same issues. Electronic ignition systems failed repeatedly. Hydraulic lines on the excavator that was positioned to help control the tree's fall developed leaks that should not have been possible given the equipment's recent inspection history. A cable on the winch system snapped under load that was well below its rated capacity, nearly injuring 2 workers who had to scramble to safety. By early afternoon, Anthony made the decision to halt work for the day and have all equipment thoroughly inspected by mechanics before proceeding. That night, another crew member quit without explanation, and the company medic, a woman named Ella, who traveled between work sites providing first aid and safety training, reported that she had been receiving an unusual number of complaints about symptoms that had no apparent physical cause. Headaches, nausea, vertigo, and a general feeling of malaise that seemed to affect crew members whenever they were near the marked tree. Despite all the warning signs, the company insisted the harvest continue. Anthony, feeling he had no choice if he wanted to keep his job, ordered the tree marked for cutting the following morning. The actual felling took hours longer than it should have, and required multiple crew members working in rotation because no one could tolerate extended periods near the tree without experiencing the physical symptoms Ella had been documenting. When the tree finally fell, the sound it made was wrong somehow. Not just the expected crash and crack of splitting wood, but something that several crew members later described as almost like screaming. The tree had been partially hollow, which was not uncommon in old-growth specimens. But what they found inside the hollow section was deeply disturbing. Human remains, old and incomplete, wrapped in what appeared to be decayed textile or leather. Alongside the remains were objects that Ella immediately recognized from her background in anthropology as indigenous ritual items, including carved bone implements, shell beads, and fragments of what might have been ceremonial regalia. Work stopped immediately, and law enforcement and state cultural resource officials were called to the site. The remains were carefully extracted and documented, and preliminary analysis suggested they were several hundred years old, potentially representing a burial practice that predated European contact in the region. The tree itself had apparently been selected as a burial site because of the natural hollow in its trunk, and the symbols carved on the exterior were markers indicating the tree's sacred status. Anthony and his crew had, despite their best intentions and in ignorance of the full cultural significance, desecrated what amounted to a gravesite. The psychological impact on the crew was immediate and severe. Within a week, 5 crew members had left the company, citing various reasons, but all clearly shaken by what had happened. Anthony himself began experiencing symptoms that his doctor initially attributed to stress, but that seemed to go beyond normal stress responses. Recurring fever with no apparent infection. Hallucinations consisting primarily of seeing figures in traditional indigenous dress standing at the edges of his peripheral vision, and vivid, intrusive thoughts about the tree and what had been inside it. More disturbing were the reports from other crew members of similar experiences. The symbols from the tree appeared in their dreams. They heard sounds in the forest at night when they were home, far from the work site. Sounds that seemed like wind through branches, or voices speaking in languages they did not understand. 3 crew members sought treatment from mental health professionals for anxiety and post-traumatic stress. One was hospitalized after experiencing what doctors termed an acute psychotic episode, during which he became convinced that spirits from the tree were following him. Eventually, representatives from local tribal nations were able to perform ceremonies at the site where the tree had stood. The remains found inside the trunk were reburied according to traditional practices, with appropriate rituals conducted by tribal elders who expressed both grief and anger about the desecration that had occurred. The ceremony seemed to help somewhat. The acute symptoms that crew members had been experiencing gradually lessened, though many reported ongoing effects that persisted for months or years afterward. The logging company relocated its operations to a different area and designated the section where the marked tree had stood as permanently off-limits for harvest, establishing it as a cultural resource protection zone. Anthony eventually transferred to a different company in a different state, unable to continue working in forests, where he had to constantly worry about repeating the mistake he had made. Years later, he still experiences periodic nightmares about the tree, and still occasionally sees figures in his peripheral vision that vanish when he turns to look directly at them. The tree stump, despite being dead wood that should have dried and decayed according to normal processes, continues to weep dark sap whenever it rains. An ongoing phenomenon that has been photographed and documented by researchers, but never adequately explained. The area surrounding the stump has been avoided by wildlife, showing none of the usual signs of animal activity that would be expected in a forest environment, as if creatures instinctively recognize that something about that location is wrong. Local indigenous communities continue to maintain the site, performing periodic ceremonies and ensuring that the mistakes made during that November harvest operation are not repeated. While the story of the hollow tree serves as a reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some warnings should never be ignored, regardless of economic pressures or legal technicalities. Luke checked his equipment and confirmed that the recording had captured the entire event. He also noted his own physical state, documenting the symptoms he was experiencing: nausea, mild vertigo, a persistent feeling of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. He packed his gear quickly and hiked back to the trailhead, eager to return to his studio where he could analyze the recording properly. That evening, working in his home studio with professional audio analysis software, Luke examined the recording in detail. What he found was genuinely puzzling. The sound existed primarily in a frequency range between 15 and 35 hertz, below the normal range of human hearing, but within the range that humans can perceive as vibration, and that can cause physical discomfort. This frequency range was sometimes called infrasound, and it was known to produce feelings of unease, nausea, and even hallucinations in sensitive individuals. But the unusual aspect was not the frequency itself, but the pattern and source. The sound showed characteristics that did not match any natural phenomenon Luke was familiar with. It was too regular to be wind or geological activity, but too complex to be machinery or human-made equipment. The waveform displayed patterns that suggested some kind of interference between multiple sources, as if several different generators of sound were operating simultaneously and creating complex interactions. Luke shared the recording with colleagues in the audio engineering community, and their analysis confirmed his observations while adding more questions. One colleague noted that the fundamental frequency shifted slightly during the recording in a way that suggested the source was moving. But the Doppler effect was wrong for any known moving object. Another colleague identified harmonic overtones that should not exist if the sound was being produced by mechanical means. The recording began circulating online, shared through audio forums and paranormal investigation groups. Hundreds of people downloaded it and listened, and that was when things became seriously concerning. Multiple listeners reported experiencing severe adverse reactions to the recording. Headaches that persisted for hours, vivid nightmares featuring themes of being lost in forests or pursued by unseen presences. In 3 cases, people reported experiencing panic attacks while listening to the audio, something that seemed extreme given that the sound itself was not particularly loud or jarring when played through normal speakers. One listener claimed to have suffered a seizure, though medical evaluation could not establish a definitive connection to the audio file. Luke became alarmed by these reports and made the decision to remove the recording from public distribution. But by that time, it had been downloaded and shared widely enough that copies continued to circulate beyond his control. Researchers from Oregon State University became interested in the phenomenon and organized a formal investigation. A team including acoustic specialists, geologists, and psychologists traveled to the Mount Hood area with sophisticated recording equipment and scientific protocols for documenting any unusual sounds. They established a base camp and spent 5 days conducting measurements at various locations within the region where reports had been concentrated. On the 3rd day, they recorded the sound. Their equipment captured data that largely confirmed what Luke had documented, but they also gathered additional information. Seismic monitoring showed no unusual ground vibrations that might explain the sound. Atmospheric measurements showed no unusual weather conditions. Electronic equipment that might have been generating interference was ruled out through systematic testing. The research team was left with high-quality recordings of a phenomenon they could not explain. Analysis of the research team's data revealed something that increased the mystery rather than solving it. The sound appeared to originate from multiple points simultaneously, as if sources were distributed throughout the forest rather than emanating from a single location. Triangulation attempts using multiple recording devices produced impossible results, suggesting the sound was either being reflected in ways that defied normal acoustic behavior, or was somehow being generated from within the forest canopy and ground simultaneously. More concerning was a finding from the psychological assessment component of the study. Team members who were exposed to the sound directly in the field showed measurable changes in brain activity patterns, particularly in regions associated with fear response and spatial orientation. These changes persisted for hours after exposure, and in some cases were accompanied by reported experiences of mild hallucinations or intrusive thoughts. The investigation was quietly suspended after the lead researcher was hospitalized following what was officially described as a severe migraine episode, but which the researcher privately confided to colleagues involved much more disturbing symptoms. Hallucinations of figures moving through the forest, a persistent sensation of being watched, auditory hallucinations of voices speaking in unknown languages. Medical evaluation found elevated stress hormones and disrupted sleep patterns, but could identify no organic cause for the acute symptoms. The university research team's findings were documented in internal reports, but never published in peer-reviewed journals, partly because the data was too inconsistent for publication, and partly because institutional review board concerns were raised about the ethics of exposing research subjects to a phenomenon that appeared to have genuine psychological and physiological effects. The sound continues to be reported periodically by hikers in the Mount Hood area. Forest Service rangers are aware of the phenomenon and have noted it in their incident logs. But there is no official explanation or warning system. The area remains open to public access with standard wilderness warnings, but no specific mention of acoustic anomalies. Luke deleted all copies of his recording from his personal archives after learning about the adverse effects other people experienced, and he has refused multiple requests to recreate or redistribute the audio. He suffered from recurring nightmares for several months after his initial encounter with the sound. Dreams that always featured the forest and always included a presence he could sense but never fully see. These nightmares have diminished over time, but have never completely stopped. Attempts to locate and identify the source of the sound have failed repeatedly. Investigators who have spent extended periods in the area hoping to document the phenomenon have come away frustrated, as the sound appears and disappears according to no predictable schedule. When it does occur, it defies the normal rules of acoustic propagation, seeming to exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Indigenous groups from the region, when asked about the phenomenon, have generally declined to comment publicly, though one tribal elder mentioned privately that certain areas of the forest have always been considered spiritually active, and that sounds without apparent sources have been part of oral tradition for generations. The elders suggested that some boundaries exist for reasons that Western science is not equipped to understand, and that perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather respected. The phenomenon remains officially unexplained. The recordings that exist are studied occasionally by researchers interested in anomalous acoustic events, but no consensus has emerged about what might be generating the sound or why it produces such consistent physiological and psychological effects on those who experience it. Hikers continue to report encounters, and the online hiking community continues to debate whether the phenomenon is natural, artificial, or something else entirely. Luke refuses to discuss his experience in detail beyond acknowledging that it happened, and that he regrets having shared the recording publicly. The forest around Mount Hood maintains its secrets, and somewhere in those ancient stands of Douglas fir and mountain hemlock, a sound continues to pulse through the air and ground, waiting for the next person who will hear it and wonder what it means and where it comes from and why it creates such profound unease in everyone who experiences it.